Hello, good morning, or if you're listening to this later on, good afternoon, or good evening, or night. So, this is week 13, and we are comparing, and this is the exam question. I sent you a separate email about the exam questions that you'll have and how that's functioning. Please just feel free to, it's probably easier than me explaining it again for you just to read that email and write me if you have any questions on this. But this is the potential exam question, or this is definitely an exam question that will be on your exam, and you will again be choosing 5 out of those 6. Compare how Islam connected to the diverse regions of the world that became part of the Islamic world to the ways that Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism functioned in Tang, China. And, you can see that religion can act as a unifying force, but there's also a lot of debates over religion, and I want you to pay attention to both these things in this. So we're looking at how religion could act in 2 very different ways. We looked at Christianity and Buddhism. This time we're going to look not only, before we looked at the spread of Buddhism and how Buddhism worked, here we're going to look at Buddhism in one particular place and how its relationship to Confucianism and Taoism, and looking more at how the Chinese viewed religion, which is a really important idea. And it's very different than how both the religion functioned in the Islamic world or what was known as the Christian world or the Judeo-Christian world. It was a different idea of religion. So I want you to be thinking about those differences as well. So we're going to start with Islam, and your text gave you a really good overview of how Islam began. So I'm not going to talk about Muhammad. I'm going to let you read about that in your textbook. But what I would like to there are 2 kind of things here that I'd like you to pay particular attention to. And one of them is the 4th point. According to Muslim tradition, the Quran was compiled between 644 and 655 CE. Modern scholarship would suggest the early 700 CE. You see that sometimes there's a religious tradition, but when people go back and try and prove it through modern scholarship, you might get a different answer. And it's hard to tell, especially when you're looking at this distance, which is the real answer. With this. So it's not necessarily like the Muslims or the Muslim tradition is wrong. It's just that modern scholarship can't verify this, and other evidence points to the early 700 CE. And religion is different when you're looking at it as a historian, where you can't say anything until you can prove it, than it is if you're a member of that faith, when you would have literally this idea of faith. And the other kind of important difference you get with Islam is the holy book there, the Quran. You can certainly compare it to the Bible in many ways, in that they're both central holy books that were spread and were really key to the spreading of the religion. The Quran has more an idea of direct transmission from God. And you can compare that to the Christian Bible. Now, there are Christians who say that the Bible is completely true. It's called the inerrancy. It means that there's no, every word in the Bible is true. There are Christians who believe that. But even the Christians who believe that would say that the Bible is divinely inspired. They don't say, there's not part of the Christian traditions that says that God directly narrated it and somebody was just writing down what God was saying. That's not how Christians view the Bible. Now, if you're a member of a Christian church, especially a more conservative Christian church, you might have gone to Sunday school and heard, the Bible's absolutely true, just believe everything. But that's not how. There are much more complicated debates within Christianity, especially within Christian scholars, and there are debates about, how different books of the Bible, how valid each book of the Bible is. When it was written, and not everybody, even among Christian scholars, would say that the Bible was even divinely inspired. Although usually, being part of the Christian truth does actually talk about the Bible having a broader truth. But the idea here, it's hard when I can't see you because I'm talking about some kind of complicated ideas about religion that may go against what you've already heard, especially again if you're a member of any particular religion. But the big thing to take away from this is when you look at the Quran, that the Quran, it's an essential part of the Islamic faith. The Quran was literally God's word that Muhammad was just writing down. Whereas the Bible, again, even those Christians who believe that the Bible is absolutely true, would say that there were authors writing it. They wouldn't say that it was actually directly narrating what God said. They would say that they were divinely inspired. And that's an important difference. This is Mecca. We're going to talk more about Mecca momentarily, but you can look and see the kind of modern. Obviously, this isn't what Mecca looked like then, but you can see the modern city of Mecca here. It's a nice picture text. So, one thing is early Islamic history and beliefs. There's only one God. Muhammad is the prophet. Muhammad is not God. They're very, very clear about that in the Islamic religion. And it's one of the big differences between Islam and Christianity, whereas Jesus is in Christianity seen as the Son of God, as part of God, as divine himself. It's like a key component of the Christian religion. Islam says that both Moses and Jesus were prophets and not divine. So Islam respects Jesus and says it's a prophet, he's a prophet, but does not say he's not divine. So there's only one God. Now, again, Christians would call themselves monotheistic because they would see Jesus as part of as part of God, like God, and there's the Creator God, there's the Holy Spirit, and there's Jesus. That developed over time as well in Christianity, but Islam would say that they're therefore not monotheistic. And Islam recognizes only one God. Islam means submission. Muslims are those who submit, in this case, submit to God's will. You have, now, your text, I'm not going to give you all the details because I think you could read about this in your text better, but if you look at 622 CE, you have the hijrah to Medina, from Mecca. So remember, as you read in your text, Muhammad is born in Mecca. They go to Medina, and then this is really an important moment because you have the Constitution of Medina, and that replaces tribal authority. So you have here again the idea of not just a religion, but a religion with a political basis. Very different than Christianity. Christianity was persecuted in the Roman Empire, as you read, for quite some time before it was recognized as an authoritative religion. And it was much longer before Christianity became kind of part of the legal system, part of the authority system. But Islam almost right away was the idea of political authority. And even though the tribal authority remained important, there was an idea that there was a religious authority, an Islamic culture, an Islamic idea that could bring all these different tribes together and actually bring peace. That's actually why the authorities in Medina invited Muhammad, why he was able to come there, the hope that he could bring peace. And this happened. And then you have the conquest, and then he went back to conquest of, take over Mecca in 624 CE. And that's the Battle of Badr. I can't quite see, you have to roll your R's a little bit to say that right. And I can't quite do that. But that's the battle that brought Mecca back in, that brought Mecca under Islamic authority. Before that, the authorities of Mecca thought it was too divisive. And then after having after having developed an establishment of kind of power base at Medina, they were able to come back and retake over Mecca. And this is a picture of this battle that's in your text. Now, when I'm doing this live for you, I try to ask you guys to figure out how all these 5 pillars lead to cultural unity. Because again, we're looking at this as historians. It's not even like when you do world religions, you're just supposed to memorize these 5 pillars. You've probably done this at some point. But what I'm interested in you going one step further, because this is a college course, and asking you to think about how this leads to cultural unity. So I'll just go and talk about how each one of these leads to cultural unity, since we can't talk together about this. So the first one is there's no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet. And this is obviously opposed to the polytheism that was common at the time. There's only one God. But it was also an opposition to the Christian idea that Jesus is God. There's only one God, and both Jesus and Muhammad were prophets in the Islamic view. And that view, that itself didn't necessarily, it led to cultural unity in that there was one idea. Besides, before this, was a bunch of tribes, a bunch of different ideas about gods. But this is an idea of bringing people together. Now, it also, we're going to find out more when we read the next chapter, would later lead to opposition to Christians, and this was another reason why there could be conflict between Islam and Christianity. But for this, especially at first, when you're dealing with the original idea of a lot of different tribes, a lot of different gods, the idea there's one God, everybody has to kind of believe in this one God with Muhammad. That it tends to be culturally unifying. As we saw again in Mecca, the idea of the constitution basically superseding tribal authority. The idea of praying 5 times a day and always praying toward where Mecca is, so no matter where you were in the Islamic world, and again, before the Islamic world was much smaller, but as it grew and expanded, there's an idea that there's one place that everybody prays to. And the fact that people have to pray 5 times a day, no matter where they are, that is something that, again, leads to cultural unity. It's something that Muslims, even in very different cultural contexts, can identify with. Now, fasting sun up to sundown during the month of Ramadan, which in fact starts Thursday, and happy Ramadan to anybody, Ramadan Mubarak, I think is what you say, to anybody, any Muslims among us who will be starting Ramadan then. So basically, you don't fast for a whole month. You can't not eat for a whole month, but you fast from sun up to sundown during this time. Now, the idea of this really brings the community together. A lot of you said really great things in your discussion, and a lot of you talked about, when you talked about the unity of Christianity, you said it didn't just bring like unity over different cultures, but between like the poorer people and the wealthier people within the community. And Ramadan is really meant to do this, because if you're a Muslim and you don't have to, if you're sick or you have some health issue, or if you're pregnant or if you're nursing, you don't have to. So not everybody, but usually most Muslims at some point in their lives have started fasting for Ramadan. And it helps everybody experience hunger. So most Muslims will know what it's like to be hungry, because it's, again, a whole day that you don't eat. And it's supposed to, even the wealthiest Muslim, therefore, will have experienced this. And ideally, this will help them basically understand what it's like to be poor, and kind of help them have more compassion for the hunger of the poorest members of the community. And then there's also a really nice tradition of you basically, when you break your fast, and a lot of times breaking your fast is a community meal, especially during more important days of Ramadan. There'll be times when the community will be able to get together and break a fast together. And that's something that's very a nice way of bringing the broader community together. The other big thing, and this is what's probably most unique about Islam, well, Ramadan is a distinctive characteristic, but the pilgrimage to Mecca, if you're financially able, you're not supposed to go into debt to do this. But for example, you would supposed to go to Mecca before you take any other trip. And it's very culturally unifying as Islam spread. No other religion had this emphasis on travel, where almost everybody, at least the wealthier people or the more affluent people, no matter in a different culture, will have had this one experience of going to Mecca, and then you'd have met Muslims from all these different places in this one place. So this, again, is very culturally unifying. And then as it spread all over the world and changed, and you had all these different some different views of Islam, everybody would come together in one place. You don't really have that in any other religion. The idea of paying alms is kind of a taxation, the importance of charity. That's very important in a universalizing faith. That is something that's actually very common for almost all universalizing faiths. Is something, but it basically brings more, again, community to the religion. The idea that you should be giving and caring, and it's the idea of community, that you should care about people who are poorer than you, and you see this in Christianity as well. So this is something that's more common. You see this in Buddhism. This is something that's more common in what you'd call universalizing faiths. And I've just discussed, ideally, how this led to cultural unity for each one of these. Again, we'd be discussing this together if this were a place where we were, if we were, again, all together. Okay, so the spread of Islam. Muhammad dies theoretically 632 CE. There are some accounts that say that he was alive later, but we're not going to go into that for this particular class. And you have the caliphs, the successors of him, and then this is actually, it's really remarkable, because as your text says, you have other big empires like Alexander the Great's empire that just crumbles right after. And the Muslim religion, the Muslim empire, did not do this. And it kept expanding, and it kept growing even after the death of the Prophet. So jihad refers to both spiritual struggle and the military spread of Islam. It's seen currently in the United States as a kind of frightening word. For some people, it's sometimes associated with terrorism. It should not be associated with terrorism. I want to emphasize that Islam should not, as a religion, be associated with terrorism. Both Christians and Muslims, almost all religions, including Buddhists, have done horrific things in the name of the religion. That does not mean the religion itself should be associated with terrorism, and nor should jihad. It's both. It can be a spiritual struggle, a struggle within yourself to submit to God's will, but it could also mean the military spread of Islam. And you have Dar al-Islam, the world of Islam, and Dar al-Harib, the world of warfare. Islam spread throughout Southwest Asia and North Africa, modern-day Syria, Egypt, and Iraq. I'm going to let you read the details in your textbook. Took over the Byzantine Empire took over. I should say, took over territories in the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire was able to survive until the Ottomans in the 1400s by withdrawing from their territory. The Caesarean Empire was completely destroyed. And then you have these two dynasties that bring Islam together politically. So you have kind of a political. Basically, you have Islam. It's a religion, but it's also political rule. In the Umayyad dynasty and the Abbasid dynasty. And this just gives you a nice map to show this. It's harder for me to go over this with you because I can't show you the different things, but you can look and see how exactly this happened. Okay. So I want to, you can read about the two empires in your text, but there are certain things that I want to talk about with these ideas of challenges in the spread of Islam. And one of them is Arab versus non-Arab people. And this is something that will actually become, this conflict will actually be reflected later on as Islam spreads even more. Originally, Islam was a religion among people who would construct themselves as Arab, in the Middle East, who would speak Arabic, for example. But as it spread to people whose first language was non-Arabic, and you would call them, non-Arab people. And yet, the Quran is, as I say, explicit in the rejection of superiority of Arabs versus non-Arabs. It's explicit about the equality of all people. It actually talks about racial equality, even. They don't use the word race because that wasn't a concept then. But much more the idea of equality of all people than, for example, the Bible. The Bible implies equality of all people in many places. But the Quran talks about this in a much more explicit way. But there's a difference, and we can see this in almost all religions, between what a religion says and how people actually act. And how people actually acted in this religion was that non-Arab people, especially in the Umayyad dynasty, were often experienced discrimination. And a famous figure here is Abu Muslim, which is something that was discussed in your text. He says the only ancestry is Islam. His basic idea was that, and he actually was drawing from the Quran, there is no difference between Arabs and non-Arabs. That if you're Islamic, you're part of this broader community of Islam, and that's all that matters. And the Abbasid Empire had more of a Persian focus. So Persian was spoken in parts of this as well. And again, in Muhammad's very famous last sermon, he also discussed this idea of this broader equality of all people. But at the same time, in your textbook discusses this as well, as you're seeing Islam, this is really key to Islam becoming a broader global religion. This idea that you don't have to be Arab, you don't have to speak Arabic to be Muslim. That it's broader than that. This is really the ability of Islam to leave its Arab roots and spread to become a truly global religion. The Arabic language is nonetheless central to Islam. It replaced Greek in the Muslim world. For example, Greek had been the dominant language, or the language that most in this area beforehand that most people would speak, that would be unifying. Arabic language would as well. And there is a focus on, and this is again another cultural unifying things, even if Muslims can't speak Arabic fluently, and many cannot around the world, there's an idea of knowing enough at least to be able to study the Quran in Arabic. So Arabic is still kind of a unifying force. So again, to spread, to be a truly global religion, to be a universalizing religion, Islam had to transcend the idea of Arabs being superior to non-Arabs, but the Arabic language still remains central to Islam. Okay, this is another really important way that Islam was able to spread. Again, I'm really hoping you've read this before you've listened to the lecture, because I'm relying on you to have some of this basic knowledge rather than explaining everything to you in the lecture. But you have the caliphate, and that is the political realm of Islam. So when you have an Islamic power, when you had these Islamic empires, the caliphate would rule. But then you have the ulama, the Islamic scholars, and they are the ones who developed Sharia law. Now, Sharia law is central to Islamic empires, but you have the caliphate weakening over time. So you have politically the political empires of Islam weakening over time, and you have what political decentralization. That means there's not one political center anymore. And then you have what you have competing caliphs. And then when you have political fragmentation, you have the ulama, the religious leaders, becoming more and more powerful. So this was an important thing. This is something I asked about in your quiz for the Abbasid dynasty as well. The Abbasid dynasty did not have, you had political rulers who were supposed to be influenced by Islam, but then you had religious rulers. And the fact that you have these religious rulers having more and more power means that Islam does not have to have a political center. So even after Islamic dynasties fell, as they've risen and fallen, you've had Islamic scholars that can exercise independently of political power. Now, one of the questions asks you to look at debates within Islam. One of the big ones is Sunni versus Shiite Islam. The majority of the Islamic world is Sunni. Today, Sunni means tradition. The Shiites it literally means the party of Ali. Believes that everybody, to have authority in Islam, you need to be descended from Ali. And he was married to Muhammad's daughter. And you have this idea of imams, and imams, basically, the best way to explain this, and again, I can't explain to you, and you wouldn't be able to remember enough in just a modern, because if we're just only doing the Islamic world, we talk a lot about the difference between Sunni and Shiites. But even in this lecture, we have to go on to China. So the thing to remember is that basically it's a conflict over who the power figure should be descended from. And there's more overlap between spiritual and political authority and in the Shiite world, in the Shiite Islam. There's a conflict between Sunni and Shiites that continue to deal today. Sunnis and Shiites have often been able to get along today, as have, for example, Protestants and Catholics. However, in times like Iraq, for example, the Sunni-Shiite conflict is a very real one, a very vivid one. It has not always been, but currently, as the Sunni identities and the Shiite identities become politicized, there is conflict. So, just as if there's conflict between Protestants and Catholics in, say, for example, Northern Ireland, whereas in the United States, this isn't there's not like a lot of fighting and like constant conflict between Protestants and Catholics. There are in some areas of the country, and in Sunnis and Shiites, there are conflicts that you may be, if you studied Iraq or if you looked at that, there are as well. But there are other places where Sunnis and Shiites have been able to get along, but these are two very different sects of Islam. So this is the map that shows from 750 onward to 1000 CE. You're seeing more and more political fragmentation in this. So you're seeing, if you look at the green, you'll see the Sunni Muslim states. If you look at the pink, you'll see the Shiite Muslim states. And then you have the Byzantine Empire still hanging on here as well. Now again, even in some Shiite Muslim states, as in Egypt, you still have the majority of people there being Sunni. So it's a complicated thing. Right now, the big Shiite power is Iran in the world. Iran, and to some extent Yemen. There's a Sunni Shiite conflict as well. And then the rest of the world is the rest of the most of the rest of the Islamic world is Sunni. But this is how it looked from 750 to 1000 CE. Okay, now this is something really interesting. We talked about, and this was a true-false question on your quiz. Um, we talked about the earlier spread of Islam. It did spread through military conquest. But what's interesting is it spreads to Africa through trade, basically through merchants. Merchants, as I mentioned, the status of merchants here, you have a much higher status of merchants in Islam. Muhammad himself was a merchant. He was married to a wealthy widow of a merchant. So merchants have a higher status in Islam than any other place. Certainly more than you'd see in China. Certainly more than you see in the Christian religion. Merchants have a high status, and they're part of this. They travel. Both merchants and Islamic missionaries travel together. So you see this, and you look. It spread to both West Africa and East Africa through trade. Right now, currently, Christianity is a major religion in Africa, but that did not happen until the 19th century, until the late 1800s. So really, you're really almost talking the 1900s. So basically, the last century, very relatively recently, from historical period, is when Christianity took roots in Africa. Islam has a much older and more ancient hold on Africa, and you see it not in Central Africa, but in West Africa and East Africa. The gold, as you read in your primary sources, was really important. Gold and salt and slaves were traded through from basically West and East, especially West Africa, to the rest of the Islamic world. Slaves were very important. One big thing you see is that in Islam, if you're a fellow Muslim, if you're already converted to Islam, you can't be made a slave. But there were a lot of people from Central Africa who weren't Muslim, and then they could be captured and traded as slaves. And that became what you'd call the sub-Saharan slave trade, or the trans-Saharan slave trade that went over the Sahara Desert. The Muslim rule in the West Africa, especially in West Africa, to some extent in East Africa, but especially in West Africa, Muslim rules tended to be much more centralized than other parts of Africa. And this isn't better or worse; it's just different. There's a more kind of centralized rule. Other parts tended to have more local control, tended to be smaller political units. But the big empires in Africa during this time were Muslim. You had visits of Muslim scholars from other parts of the world, so they're much more connected. So the primary source, you see people dazzled. The primary source that I had you read, and I wanted to make sure you read it, so I put it as one of your quiz questions. You can see them being dazzled by Muslim Ghana's gold. A lot of people were dazzled by the wealth. A lot of them praised the rulers. They found Ghana to be a well-ruled country, but they were upset by paganism. The fact that even though Ghana was an Islamic country, it was not thoroughly Islamic, and there were in the same way that you look at other countries if they were used to becoming basically another Islamic country in what would be the Middle East. So you see these different ways of doing things. They also talked about the sickness. That wasn't so much that Ghana, I want to make this clear, that Ghana was somehow less healthy than other places. It was a different disease environment. So when people traveled to many places, they would often get sick. So it wasn't that Ghana was somehow less hygienic than other places during this period of time. But yeah, when you look at the big thing to remember about Africa is spreading through trade. And this is how these parts of sub-Saharan Africa were integrated to the rest of the world. And this is a really good map that shows this. If you look at this, you can see the parts of West Africa that were connected to, and you kind of look at the purple line that shows you the Empire of Ghana here, and you see Jen there. I'm going to talk about Jen momentarily. Jenne, you can see there. And then if you look at East Africa, to this day, North Africa is still the Islamic roots are still there, and East Africa is still Islamic. So what happened now is still with us today as far as religion goes. It's what I've said before is why it's important to study religion. Religion tends to stay with you much longer than political units come and go. But when a religion takes place, that has much long-lasting impact. This is a mosque in Jen. Jen was one of the this is later on, not the point we're talking about now, but Jen would have one of the first medical schools, actually some of the first eye surgeries in the world. So it became a very sophisticated, very important empire. Okay, gender in Islam. This is another place where you see some conflict in Islam. You have women in pre-Islamic Arabia. Unlike other places, women actually did have a lot of power, and you see this in Muhammad's first wife, who, for example, was a wealthy, she was a widow, but she was able to, she owned her own money, she was a trader, she was a successful merchant in herself, that she was a more successful merchant than he was, and that was widely acknowledged. Now, one big conflict you see is veiling. And this is a conflict that you still see in Islam today. Veiling is not in the Quran. The Quran does not. This Quran says people have to dress modestly, but they don't discuss veiling in particular. Even as early as Muhammad's later wives, there are the veiling was practiced. It's more of an Arabic idea. So in some places it's practiced, some places it's not. And this contains to be an idea because people, again, Muslim women who don't practice veiling say it's not in the Quran, and you're basically trying to, if you try to make people veil, you're really almost forcing a cultural thing, not a religious idea. And then other people will insist that veiling women is very, very key to being Islamic. So you see this controversy even early on, and this is a controversy that definitely continues till today. Islam does allow for multiple wives, 4 wives, and then basically as many concubines as you can afford. Now, modern days, you don't really have concubines aren't a thing anymore. But women also had the protection of dowry. A woman owned her own dowry. She kept her own dowry. That was an economic security that she had. Women could own property. There were protections in divorce. Muhammad had many later wives. Most of them were widows. The most controversial one, and to be honest with you, I'm unhappy with the way your textbook does this. And I try, again, I'd like to be able to see you and talk to you more about this. Because a lot of people find the news that his favorite wife, Aisha, he married when he was 9 or 10, although did not consummate the marriage until later. The book just kind of throws it out there, and it's a kind of shocking thing to our sensibilities. And I think, in a way that for our modern times it should be shocking. Yeah, again, this would be easier in a discussion. It's hard to know what to say, but there were, again, I do want to make it clear here that Muhammad was not, in marrying someone who was very young, and again, waiting to consummate the marriage until she was more mature. That was not culturally unusual then. He was not this was not an introduction of Islam. This was something that was common culturally at the time. Okay, Islam and culture. This is another important thing of thinking about what does Islam do, and basically some of the debates within Islam, also how it's kind of culturally unifying. What's really interesting is you would not have been able to have the Renaissance, and unfortunately, I'm not able to talk about the Renaissance or anything that's happening in the European world, just because I can only, the lectures have to be a certain length, and this is what we're going to be focusing on today, especially with you being scattered like this. I've chosen to focus on sort of some key themes, but I hope certainly the quiz was meant to encourage you to read and understand more that was happening with the Renaissance later on, as or like not the Renaissance isn't happening now, but what's happening in the Christian world. But basically, in the Christian world, the work of the Greek scholars was basically lost, Aristotle and Plato, and it was preserved through Islamic scholars. So later on, when you do see the Renaissance happening, they actually were drawing on the works of the Greek scholars that have been preserved by Islamic scholars. Drew from China as well. The invention of paper was really key here. They drew Arabic numbers from India. Kind of very key to the contributions of the development of algebra, geometry, and arithmetic, which was very, again, used worldwide. And this is what you call the cosmopolitan side of Islam. It's the idea of being part of a world global culture. And you see both things. You see Islam, the idea of trying to take over other religions and take over territory, but you also see kind of a tolerant cosmopolitan side of Islam, where you can bring these different cultures together. And generally speaking, and you see this definitely in Spain as well, you do see, in fact, most Islamic empires did not convert, some of them, this happened sometimes, but most Islamic empires did not convert by force everybody in the empire. A lot of times Islamic empires were willing to tolerate Christian minorities, and certainly Jewish minorities. Basically, during this period of time that we're going to talk about, It was easier to be Jewish in an Islamic country than it was to be Jewish in a Christian country. All right, now we're going to go to religion and culture in Tang and Song China. And again, lecture. I originally wanted to keep these lectures shorter, but it's hard to do and get any kind of substance, especially when we're comparing these two very different regions. So the Tang Dynasty, 618 to 960 CE, it's considered one of the greatest dynasties, along with the Han Dynasty by the Chinese themselves. Chang'an was the biggest and most spectacular city in the world at the time. Your text calls it the best administrated. It was definitely the most powerful empire in the world at the time. And in the 600s and 700s CE, it was very cosmopolitan, a lot of connections with Central Asia, which at this point, as you read in your text, was connections with Islam. Some of you said in your discussions last week, your forums last week, how important the Silk Road was both for the spread of Christianity and the spread of Buddhism. It was also important in the spread of Islam as well, the Silk Road. And you basically see this very important. So the Silk Road made the Tang Dynasty very wealthy, very rich, and it also gave them these other broader cultural influences, including Buddhism. In the 800s, the military became weaker, the Tang Empire shrunk, and there was more of a fear of foreign influences. So you see a difference. We're going to talk about that. That's very important to understand kind of Chinese religion as well. The 600s and 700s were these very open to foreign influences, very confident. And then as the Tang Dynasty became more insecure, they started to become more afraid of foreign influences. The Song Dynasty, 960 to 1279 CE, this is going to be discussed in your next chapter. I'm not going to have a chance to talk about it then. And it's important to understand, I'm going to just give you a little bit kind of what happens after the Tang Dynasty with religion as well. It's a very wealthy empire. Hangzhou was the capital. It was definitely considered the greatest city in the world, so pay attention to that. That's when the big inventions that changed the world were invented in China. They invented gunpowder. Paper money was the first time you saw this manufacturing revolution. It was militarily much weaker than the Tang Dynasty, which is why the Chinese don't celebrate the Song Dynasty in the way that they do the Tang Dynasty. They had constant problems with nomads. And you see in the Song Dynasty a growth of this belief that foreigners were barbarians. So again, the Tang Dynasty, especially the early and middle Tang Dynasty, were much more open to foreign influences within their borders. You started to see an idea of foreigners as barbarians much more in the Song Dynasty. This gives you the Tang state, and it also shows you how it kind of comes up against the Abbasid dynasty as well. So this gives you take a minute to look at this, figure out where everything was geographically. The Tang Dynasty was the biggest, as China at its absolute biggest, although it did not completely control Tibet. This is kind of a big debate today, which I'm not going to go into right now. But the what's considered China has basically grown and shrunk over time. And then you see other places like Manchuria, for example, Korea, where you have a Chinese cultural region, where you have Chinese influence, even if they're not officially part of the Tang Empire. Okay, so the religion. The major religions in China are Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism. Zoroastrianism, Christianity, and Islam also existed in the Tang China, but they were not common among Chinese. They were more common among the foreign traders. Now, the big thing you need to understand about this, and again, important if you're comparing it to the Tang Dynasty, you're comparing it to the Islamic world. The Islamic world, you could not be Islam and anything else. And this is, again, when you look at the conflict between Christianity and Islam, because you also could not be Christian and anything else. I mean, according to the religion of Islam and the religion of Christianity, there were some what you call mutually exclusive ideas. What mutually exclusive means is if you're one thing, you can't be the other thing. But the major religions in China, Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism, they weren't mutually exclusive. You could take elements of Taoism and Buddhism and also elements of Confucianism. So that's why you don't have actual religious warfare. We're going to talk about persecution of Buddhism momentarily, which came later, but that's different than what you see in the West. You could be both. You wouldn't have somebody fighting over whether the ideas of Taoism or Confucianism were best. And again, we talked last week about the theological flexibility of Buddhism, and that's something to kind of keep in mind. Buddhism did become the idea of Buddha was a god, was actually developing at this time. But nobody was fighting over whether Buddha was a god or not. there was definitely some conflict between Buddhist and Taoist priests. And in fact, the idea of Taoist monks and priests actually they got this from Buddhism. It actually was one of the ways that Taoism changed over time. But most people would consult or support both. There would be more. It was more like an individual way, like in different Buddhist monks or priests might have actually been had conflict within each religion as well. But you wouldn't, if you like, it wouldn't be like, oh, if you're a Buddhist, you can't go to a Taoist priest. That wouldn't have been a concept that they would have even understood at the time. Now, Confucianism did not have priests. It didn't comment on the afterlife, and the idea is that it's a religion or philosophy. And I guess the line between religion and philosophy can be a rather thin line. In many ways, Confucianism, with the idea of rights, was a religion. So for our purposes, we're going to consider it a religion. But if you wanted to know what happened after you died, you wouldn't find very much comment on Confucianism. So to some extent, you'd study Confucian classics and think of Confucianism as a good way to guide your life. But you might also, especially for death rituals, consult a Buddhist or a Taoist priest. Now, Confucianism in China declined after the Han Dynasty, but in later Tang, the Confucian texts became the basis for the civil service exam. And I put this in red here. The civil service exam became the major way of gaining political power. Magistrates, governors, advisors to the emperor were all basically became powerful by taking this exam. And it became even more important in the Song Dynasty. So the emperor himself was hereditary. You had a hereditary emperor. But he himself, you didn't have to take the exam to become emperor, but the actual power, the actual running of the empire was done by these scholars who studied Confucianism, and they became powerful, and they advised the emperor. They became powerful by studying the civil service exam, by taking this exam. And to take this exam, you had to know you had to know Confucian classics very well. And this is called a meritocracy. What a meritocracy is, it means that and this is the ideal, of course, is that the smartest people, the people who are most able, are the people who run the empire. So it's not, again, even though the emperor was very important, most of the day-to-day running decisions were people who had actually studied very well and were very able. Now, it gave peasants the chance to become important officials. It didn't happen all that often, and I always ask the class why, and every class has always been able to figure this out, why wealthier people would actually have a better chance of passing the exam than poorer people. Basically, wealthier people have more time to study. If you're a peasant, you have to spend a lot of time growing food, basically working on your day-to-day existence. Wealthier people can buy books, wealthier people can hire tutors, they can have their sons do nothing but study. So it tended to be wealthier people did tend to dominate in the exams and dominate in the powers. But there were times when a very, very smart peasant, especially if they could find somebody to sponsor them, if they could show their ability very early, would actually, and there were times when a poor peasant actually would rise to become an advisor to the emperor. That happened. It wasn't common, but it happened. As your textbook says, Buddhist temples actually were sources for Confucian education, especially for poorer people, and sometimes there might be a time when they might just try and basically see if there was anybody really smart in the group. It wouldn't necessarily be the idea of kind of universal education that we see now. And if somebody did show a lot of ability, they might sponsor them to study. Because if they did become an important official and you'd sponsored them, then that would help you later on. This definitely provided cultural unity. This is definitely a way that everybody around the whole empire, even though it was a very diverse empire and the spoken languages were different, people were reading the same books. Remember, the written language was different than the spoken language. So you had tremendous cultural unity. No matter where you were in China, if you were among the elite, you'd have definitely studied these books very intensely, and even poorer people would have had some familiarity with Confucianism. The civil service exam actually lasted until 1905. It was interrupted in the Mongol Yuan dynasty, which you're going to read about in the next chapter. But it lasted until 1905. So, I mean, just amazing, right? Like more than 1,000 years, this exam lasted. It was how China got its emperors. And it's, not emperors, I'm sorry. It's how China, not China got its emperors, it's how China got its rule, basically, not emperors, but how it got its governors, how it got the people who actually did the ruling. Feel free to email me any questions if you're confused by any of this. This is easier when I'm actually seeing you to talk about this. So Confucianism, again, the idea of the education was central to the superior man or gentleman. And there was an idea that education and study was more important than birth. We talked about this a little bit before, um, when we were still together in the first part of the class, when we talked about the kind of the rise of Confucianism. Um, but that's an idea that education and study are more important than birth. Now, birth was still, if you were into a wealthier family, you're going to have more time to study at this point. But that was at least an ideal, and you can again see this in the civil service exam. All educated men read Confucian classics. Literate women could read, and there were, again, wealthier women were often literate. They often helped their sons in this. And so even poor peasants had some familiarity with the Confucian classics. Now, this is another interesting thing when you look at the dividing line between religion and philosophy. Confucian texts all emphasized filial piety. Filial piety is the idea that children should respect their parents. Children should listen to their parents when they're young, and when they get old, they should take care of their parents. And on the folk level, this led to the idea of ancestor worship, which is very, very important in Chinese culture. That you should worship, that actually even after your ancestors are dead, you should still take care of them. You should put out food for them, offerings, to avoid them being hungry ghosts. And the idea that the ancestors can actually still help you after they pass away. If you take care of your ancestors and show them respect, that they will also take care of you even when they've passed away. This is not something that you see in any Confucian texts. Again, Confucian texts don't really talk about what happens after you die, but it became on the folk level, the idea of ancestor worship, which I'm going to talk more about momentarily. Now, Buddhism again connected China to the broader world. We talked about pagodas I don't think I've talked about it as much. I did talk about it in the lecture. Pagodas, they're something that's seen as quintessentially Chinese, but they were actually originated in India. And Buddhism thrived in the early Tang Dynasty. And again, the word cosmopolitan. When you call the early Tang Dynasty, it was very cosmopolitan, and the idea of being kind of a citizen of the world, rather than being as tied to one particular nationality. Buddhist monasteries became very wealthy and powerful. In the 800s CE, there started becoming attacks on Buddhism as a foreign religion. And the 840 CE, the government closed Buddhist monasteries. They confiscated their wealth. And in the Song Dynasty, they considered to keep monasteries the Buddhist monasteries weak. And while you still have Buddhism, you still have Buddhist priests, you still have monasteries, they never again became as wealthy and powerful as they were in the early Tang Dynasty. This last concept, though, is something that I really need you to understand. There's freedom to explore different spiritual ideas in China, but none could compete with the government. So this is a really important thing, both in Islam and in Christianity. There's the idea that there's one spiritual path that's true. And it's okay to persecute heretics, although this happened almost more in Christianity as it went on than it did in Islam, but it happened in both religions. It's okay to fight and for these battles and kill people, because one spiritual path is best, and you're actually helping people in the long run by having, if you're either Christian or Islam, the idea that like following your religion will help people. That's the only way to do things. And so basically, if somebody is saying something that's against that religion, they're persecuting people and leading them down a straight path. And as rulers, you have a responsibility to do something about this. That's not an idea you see in China. There's not an idea. There's basically the idea has always been you don't really totally know what happens after you die. Although there was a firm belief in ancestor worship, but there wouldn't be battles over this. So you could believe anything you wanted to in China, but none could compete with the government. So, and this is still, you still see the kind of legacy of this now. You do see persecution of Christianity in China to some extent, although there's not official persecution, that it happens. And persecution of other religious groups, but it's not because of the idea that they're saying something spiritually wrong. It's the idea that they'll cause dissension, they'll cause conflict, they'll make it harder to rule. So, if a religion in China, and this is again traditionally, even though now China is very different now than it was then, this idea is still kind of there. The idea that if a religion tries to compete with the government, it will be basically ruthlessly suppressed. But you wouldn't, if it's not actively competing with the government, you wouldn't persecute somebody just because of their beliefs. It's only if it starts to cause civil disorder. And that was, the attacks on Buddhism weren't, you're leading people astray, you're saying things that were wrong. It's the idea of a foreign religion being too powerful in China. Okay, Taoism in China, influenced by Buddhism, and they developed monasteries, monks, nuns, basically because of Buddhism. They didn't develop large monasteries like Buddhism, and also there's no persecution. There was never, because it was always considered an indigenous religion. The development of breathing exercises. Some of you might have heard of Tai Chi. It's actually become almost mainstream in the United States. That was originally from Taoism. Strong connection with the martial arts. A lot of the ideas of martial arts grew out of Taoism. Taoist classics formed a small part of the civil service exam, so most people would be familiar with Taoist classics. They're culturally unifying in this way. But the other big thing that I need you to remember, and I think this is the last slide about China, is this idea of a folk religion. And the folk religion combined Taoism, Buddhism, and Confucianism. So what most people wouldn't say, I'm a Taoist, I'm a Buddhist, or I'm a Confucianist for their religion. But there was kind of just a popular religion that combined elements of everything. So from Confucianism, you had the idea of ancestor worship. From Buddhism and Taoism, you'd have the ideas of temples. Again, with the martial arts. And so there was just kind of one religion, and there wasn't conflict between religions. Again, there would be persecution of a religion. I want to just say this again. There'd be persecution of a religion if the religion seemed to cause disorder or conflict or challenge the power of the state. But if it didn't challenge the power of the state, it could become pardonless. And this is why you do have Christianity making some inroads in China much later on when you get to the 1500s and 1600s, but then being persecuted when it seemed to threaten stability in China. That's something that would happen way in the future. Now, at this point, Christianity is not. There are some Nestorian Christians who are traders that are living in China at this time, but Christianity is not spreading in China at this time. Okay, I'd love to be able to ask for any questions. I can't because we're not together, but feel free to email me. As far as the civil service exam goes, that is your response paper, and if you haven't done any response papers, you need to do the last 3. I'll send out an email saying this as well. All right, thank you very much. Hope you have a wonderful week.